Good evening and welcome to PNP Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine. We have a great program for you this evening to celebrate a new book, Julian Bond's Time to Teach, which provides a sort of master class in the civil rights movement from one of the activists who helped to lead it. For those of you not familiar with how this virtual format works, you'll still be able to ask questions even though we can't see you. To do so, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. The chat function also will be active, and in that column, you'll find a link for purchasing Julian Bond's Time to Teach. The book is a collection of classroom lectures by Bond, who of course was an influential social justice activist, politician, professor, and writer. For over 2 decades in the latter part of his life, he taught a popular class at the University of Virginia on the history of the civil rights movement. He passed away 5 years ago, and the new book is intended to bring his teachings from the UVA class to a new generation of readers and to serve as an inspirational guide to activists in the era of the Black Lives Matter and Me Too movements. In the 1960s, Bond was a founding member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and led student protests against segregation in the South. He went on in the 1990s to help found and head the Southern Poverty Law Center. As an elected official, he served 4 terms in the Georgia House, then 6 terms in the Georgia Senate. And for nearly a dozen years, beginning in 1998, he was board chairman of the NAACP. His 1972 book, A Time to Speak, A Time to Act, was an exhortation to political involvement. The new book, Julian Bond's Time to Teach, was edited by 2 people. One is Bond's wife, Pam Horowitz, who was one of the first lawyers hired at the Southern Poverty Law Center. She worked in partnership with her late husband in multiple public, private, and academic projects and is involved in several activities honoring his legacy. The other editor is Jeanne Theoharis, a former student and teaching assistant of Bond's, including an acclaimed biography, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, and more recently, A More Beautiful and Terrible History, the Uses and Misuses of Civil Rights History. Both Pam and Jeanne are here this evening to talk about Bond and his work, and the discussion will be moderated by Vann Newkirk, who is a staff writer at The Atlantic, where he covers politics and policy and does some editing. And now, on behalf of Politics and Prose Live, I'd like to welcome Pamela Horowitz, Jeanne Theoharis, and Vann Newkirk.
All right, well, thank you so much, and thank you everybody for joining us here tonight. We are really excited to be here with you, and we really hope this conversation and this book will be light to you, will be guides to you, and will be useful in your lives. First thing I want to do is to just give people a sense of why we're here, what the book is like. So Pam and Jeanne, can you tell us a little bit more about Julian Bond's Time to Teach?
Well, yes, let me say at the outset too that the book is graced with an afterword by Vann. So he's been involved with it from the beginning. It was basically Jeanne's idea. The 3 of us, Julian and Jeanne and I, had dinner several years ago, and she raised the question then to Julian if he would think about doing a book with her on teaching civil rights history. And he said, ask me after I've retired, and you should know that I don't want to do a lot of work. And of course, that did not come to pass. But then Jeanne approached me. And by that time, I think Jeanne had figured out that the lectures were written down. And I say it that way because it's unusual to have the lectures written in full sentences, as Julian did. And the thing that I love about Jeanne's story, which she allows me to say, is that she, as his student, and then even as his TA, did not know that they were written down because Julian's delivery was that smooth. and it was only after Julian died, I think I'm right, Jeanne, that you had this light bulb go off that maybe they were written down.
I had, so when I was working on the Rosa Parks book, I'd been trying to find, I'd gone down some wormhole about some particular detail, and I'd stumbled on a lecture Julian had given. And so I started watching it. And then watching it, I was like, wait a minute, he's, and I think lots of us have notes, right? But most of us do not have notes written out in beautiful, polished sentences. And I think in the back of my head, I sort of realized, oh, he's reading full sentences and then whatever. And then literally a couple months after Julian died, I woke up and I was like, wait a minute, he wrote those out. And then I emailed Pam and I was like, did Julian write out the lectures in full sentences? And then Pam said he did, and that also he kept polishing them because he kept reading, right?
Yes, there were many revisions, and we knew his papers are at the University of Virginia, so we knew that where everything was. We weren't sure what shape it all was in, and so that leads to a shout out to Eric Wallenberg, who is a student of Jeanne's and was our research assistant, who eventually was the one who went to the University of Virginia and got all of the lecture notes, and it was a matter of constant revision. So that was the first task at hand, to figure out the latest versions and to make sure that we had everything. And the timing, I think, has worked out really well. I am sorry that it took the horrible events, starting with George Floyd and then continuing into a week ago Wednesday, in order for the book to be so timely. But I think that it is turning out that there's heightened interest in the whole issue of race. And so we really didn't do the book right away. I wasn't ready emotionally to do it. Jeanne was working on A More Beautiful and Terrible History. And so it has turned out that we were just about finished with our editing, which since it was not only written out, but it was written in Julian's beautiful prose. The editing, I think, Jeanne, is fair to say, was light. And every word, we wanted every word to be his. And so even though we had to move some things around, we can say that every word is his.
So that's one thing, you mentioned how timely it is. And I think, we don't want to go too far in this event without acknowledging exactly what's happening in the world right now. We are here after an insurrection that was fomented by the widespread belief that voting, particularly voting by Black folks, is illegitimate. And this is a book that talks about the numerous uses of violence, of shocking violence against activists, especially when it came to the issue of voting by Black folks. I know this was not planned, but I do want to know what it feels like to be releasing this work into the world in a time when it feels so uniquely resonant.
I mean, Van, like you're saying, partly we're releasing it into the world a week after also Reverend Raphael Warnock became the first Black senator elected in Georgia. I think there's no way to think about how we get Reverend Warnock without starting with Julian, right? Without his, his harnessing of the Black vote in 1965 and winning a seat in the Georgia House. And then obviously the controversy that ensued when his representative mates refused to seat him because of his opposition to Vietnam, right? So the red baiting, again, that we saw of Reverend Warnock, we can see, and that Julian then fought all the way to the Supreme Court and ultimately was seated. But so to me, we're also releasing it in this moment where we can see in many ways these decades of work, right? Of transforming Georgia, right, coming to also a very exciting fruition last week. And I think one of the hardest things about the Capitol insurrection is how much it just took that incredible milestone right out of the news, right? Something that people had spent their lives, struggling for, and then, then that madness, and then, it was hard to focus on what an achievement. I think also, so Julian Bond was an incredible storyteller, right? And so part of what the book is it is a set of stories of the Southern Civil Rights Movement. And one of the things that is all over the book is also the use of violence to prevent Black people from voting, the use of violence against people who were trying to desegregate, whether it was lunch counters or schools. And so I think for me also, I think we've heard a lot of people in the last week with this sort of like, this is not America, this is not, I can't believe this is happening. And then part of, I think, what the book gives us in this moment is a more sober, honest conversation about, well, yes, this is America. This has a much longer history. Maybe we haven't wanted to face that history. Maybe we like Julian would talk about the master narrative of the civil rights movement. And part of that master narrative was this happy ending, right? We struggled, and then 1964 Civil Rights Act, 1965 Voting Rights Act, and like, ooh, we're done. And I think that's a fable, as I like to talk about it. But I think part of what this book gives us is a much richer and more sobering look at the civil rights era.
Yeah, you mentioned,
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Pam.
Well, I was just going to say, I don't think Julian ever, when he was doing these lectures, writing them and giving them, ever contemplated that they would appear as a book. They were meant for the classroom and not a bookstore. But I think that the timing is such that he would be very pleased that they are getting out now. And not because this is any kind of a book that says this is how you need to do it. And Julian would never have taken that approach, didn't in class and in any of his, varied paths of activism. But this is a book that reminds us of the centrality of race in our country, that it's in our DNA, that, as you said, Van, if Julian were here, he would be the first to point out that what we're talking about from the beginning of the post-election business is a Black voting. And that's what is seen as illegitimate by their side. And that's what this is about. And the people who stormed the Capitol are white supremacists. And they have been with us from the beginning. They were certainly with us during the movement. And we need to understand it. And I think that people are focusing on the fact more than they have maybe at other times in our history. And so to be able to be a part of that is very gratifying to me. And especially because the book is Julian was an optimist, and because you can't have change without hope. And so I think he would want, and I want people to read the lectures and for every reader to come away with a sense of hope. You say, Van, in your afterword about inertia is the enemy of progress. And so Julian never succumbed to inertia, and we can't now throw up our hands and say, well, this is all so awful. What do we can't do anything about this horrible world.
Yeah, Jeanne, you mentioned that you talked about Reverend Warnock, and he is the first Black senator from Georgia. He is the 11th Black senator in the United States history out of about 2,000 people to hold the office total.
And is a graduate of Morehouse College.
I would be remiss.
As are you, and as was Julian, as was Martin Luther King. And now, isn't that a coincidence?
And that's Morehouse is actually where I first met Julian, and where
Yes.
the experience in my afterward comes from, where he came and gave an abridged version of one of these lectures to our class. The question I have for both of you is related to that, and it's what do you think that people are going to find, especially young folks, especially people who are very steeped in the fables of the civil rights movement, but are really interested in looking for more? What do you think they're going to find that's going to challenge those fables in this book?
Jeanne, that's one of your favorite topics. So why don't you answer that first?
It is one of my favorite topics. I mean, at base, the book is about the power of young people, right? Of what young people imagined, did, tried to do, figured out how to do. And so I think part of what what you find in the book, and I think what was so transformative about being a student of Julian's was this up close and personal sense of how you make change, how you make a movement, right? And that he would go, there are parts in the book where you're going day by day, right? This happens on the Monday, this happens on the Tuesday, this happens, right? So you begin to see how, because I think there's this way that the civil rights movement is like put up here on a shelf, on a pedestal, and it seems both like, there's this kind of, sometimes my students are like, I wish I lived back then because everybody was unified and it was, it just seemed like it just happened because, again, I think that's part of the fables. It somehow just happens. And I think one of the things that Julian's lectures did, and I think the book does, is give us a much richer, much more granular sense of what a movement looks like, right? Of how you do it, of how you don't always get it right, right? And how lots of people don't like it when it's happening. I mean, I think that's a really crucial part of the fable, right, that we've been given, is that somehow most decent people, there were these bad Southern racists, but the most decent people, once they saw the injustice, got on board. And that's really not what happened. Most Americans did not support the civil rights movement when it was happening. They didn't necessarily burn crosses, right? But they sat on the sidelines. They let things happen, like we see people doing today.
Black and white.
Black
people too.
And so I think a second thing that you get in the book is both the range of how opposition functioned, right? And also how hard it was, but also, again, obviously, I love this quote from James Baldwin, right, which becomes the title of my last book, where Baldwin basically says, in A Time to Teach, American history is longer, larger, more various, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone's ever said about it. But I think that's true of the civil rights movement. And I think that in this book, you see a civil rights movement and you see a civil rights era that's both worse and more sobering than we've been taught, but it's also more beautiful, more inspiring. People, what people imagined and how people went past what even they could imagine, right? And particularly young people, right? Because this is a story about young people and, at base. And so that's part of what's really exciting about it is taking it to a new generation of young people, of activists, of students.
Well, Van, you experienced a piece of the book when Julian came to speak to your class. So why don't you tell the people that we were with about that day?
Yeah, so I took a class at Morehouse my senior year on, it was on the King Papers. And we had the great fortune of having Julian as a guest lecturer. And he came and gave one of the lectures you see actually in the book, part of it about SNCC and about SNCC's activism with especially poor Black folks in the South, and how they made decisions to reject certain aspects and elements of respectability politics and to basically do better to meet people where they were. So one piece of the real civil rights movement that lots of people don't talk about is the real class tensions and class fissures within that, about how people were pressured to put on a certain face, to wear suits. And SNCC consciously rejected elements of that pressure when they were going out to talk to sharecroppers and children of sharecroppers and organize them. And he was telling this to a class of folks in Morehouse who were all told to be there in suits, and who were all, we were in classes where we could be docked points for not having our hair cut. And he told us, these are nice suits. It's a great suit, but it ain't gonna save you. And that was a real, it was a real big moment for a lot of us in having, number one, this Morehouse man telling us that something that was stressed to us, that was very important as part of our process of going through the college, is what we believe to be part of becoming this image. How it wasn't all that important in terms of what we actually did and accomplished in the world, and would not protect us. And tying that into seeing how people who were also in their 20s in the 60s making the same realization, it was very powerful for us. But with that said, one piece of this book and one piece of his lecture was attempting to show us and show people who read that the people who were organizing, who were activists during the civil rights movement, that they were not titans, that they were not these holy figures who could not be touched, who could not be replicated. But the interesting piece about that is I was rushing off in class to go call my dad and say, oh my God, I just met Julian Bond. And so it might do right now in our conversation to tell people a little bit more about Julian Bond and about who he was beyond the picture on the cover, beyond our imagination of him as the eyes on the prize guy. Yeah. So Pam, if you get us started on that.
Oh, sure. I'd love to talk about Julian. I think one way to convey who and what Julian was is to say that he never wanted a tombstone, he wanted a bench. And on one, he wanted the front of the bench to say race man, which he saw himself as a race man in the mold of Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, his whole life, or from the time he joined the movement at the age of 20 until the day he died. And then on the other side, he wanted it to say easily amused. And that, for me, captures a lot of what Julian was. The serious work that required the vigorous intellect that he possessed, the desire to overcome, the curiosity about the world, all of the attributes that took. And then the easily amused was a reflection of his sense of humor, which he never lost, and without which I don't think he could have done the serious work. Not everyone knows that Julian was a student at a comedy school, a graduate of a comedy school, and hosted Saturday Night Live when, as he liked to say, it was a comedy show, because Al Franken was the head writer and every skit was very funny. So I think he was just, and he was fundamentally a really nice person, and he treated his students well, and he embraced them, and they returned it, I think. And I stay in touch with a lot of them, for whom he was a very important person. And of course, he had a fabulous voice, which allowed him to sort of be the narrator of the movement, and most especially the narrator of Eyes on the Prize, which is probably going to always stand as the best documentary of the civil rights movement. But he was in a couple of movies, including Ray, and so he was a big music person, jazz and rock and roll. But he also was a member of the Four Freshmen fan club, an active member. We traveled to many places to see the Four Freshmen perform. Obviously not the original, but there still are Four Freshmen. So he had a lot of interests, and was just it was great to be around him.
Now, you just mentioned Julian's love of music, and that's one thing that I really want to point out about the book. Music was a very integral part of the lectures. And obviously, you cannot include really the lectures on music as they were given by Julian because you have a book. But here, I would love to discuss those pieces of the lecture so we can get a sense of just how important they were to thinking about this work.
Well, he did a whole lecture on the music of the civil rights movement, because it was an integral part, and it seems to be. I've thought from the beginning of Black Lives Matter that which has many parallels with SNCC and which Julian greatly admired, but it is missing the music piece largely, and I think that was a coming together of people in almost a spiritual way, and when days were difficult and scary, and people gathered for mass meetings, it was the music that lifted them up. So he really couldn't sing, but he'd like to. And so when he taught the music in his class, he encouraged people to sing, and he marveled that it was always so interesting because there were always people, usually young Black women, who had fabulous voices and who would then lead the singing in class. So I think it was a moment for all of them too, in miniature of what it had been in all those mass meetings. And then he also did a lecture called From Rhythm and Blues to Rock and Roll, which is also really good. So I don't know, at some point maybe we'll try to get his musical stuff out there.
We got to drop the playlist.
Right, we need a Spotify playlist.
Beyond music, Jeanne, are there things, are there pieces of lectures that were not included, or things that you think might be useful to know?
So just to kind of give people a sense of like what we were working with, by the end of his teaching, he was obviously using PowerPoint. And so he was bringing in all sorts of, he would bring in clips, he would bring in primary sources, he would, and obviously we were taking PowerPoint lectures and turning them into narrative, right? So, so certainly if one was going to teach out of the book, one would want to bring in like a lot of primary sources like he did alongside it. But what I think the magic of the lectures was that there was this kind of narrative, like kind of story that he's telling. And so the chapters are really organized by, aspects, moments, right? So there's a chapter on Little Rock, there's a chapter on the Albany movement, there's a chapter on, sort of the beginning of the Mississippi, SNCC's Mississippi campaign. There's so, and I should say it's the heart of the book is the Southern Civil Rights Movement from, and he gives us some prehistory in the beginning, but, the heart of it is kind of, 54 to 65, 68. So
we had one scary moment, Jeanne, when we were putting the book together, and that was when we discovered that there was no lecture on the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Right. And clearly there was no way that Julian would not have had that lecture, since that, along with the Voting Rights Act, was the legislative pinnacle of the movement. And we had, we were committed to the fact that every word had to be Julian. So that was a bit of a problem. And then Eric Wallenberg, whom we mentioned earlier, came to the rescue. I think he went to Charlottesville Wasn't that right, Jeanne? And found it.
Right, or he got the I can't remember now, or like he just kept
Or
on to like look, and so
anyway, it's in the book.
in the book, it's in the book. In terms of I mean, it's the Southern civil rights movement, right? Like, I think people who know me know that I studied the civil rights movement outside the South, right? That's not what this book is, right? It's also, there's a little bit on Black Power at the end, but this is, this is a book about the part of the civil rights movement that he really witnessed up close. And I think one of the other things to sort of say about Julian was that he was also a tremendous appreciator of scholarship on the movement. And so I think lots of us, right, when you've participated in something, when you've been an activist in something, you think that people are not getting it all that right, and there's a lot of tension, right, between activists and scholars. And Julian wasn't like that. Like, he just read and read and read and read and read, and he constantly like integrated that into the book. But the book is about the Southern civil rights movement. So what it's not is, and again, everyone who knows me, the civil rights movement took place all across the country, right? And that's not what this book is, right? This book is really focused on the Southern civil rights movement, which is what he taught me. And, that's what the course was. And so, like Pam was saying, we weren't adding stuff to make it, representative of, every sort of civil rights movement that was happening, across the country.
See, and Julian was in a unique position to have the broad picture of that Southern movement, because he was the communications director of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and at its founding meeting. So in addition to his having been there through all of this, it was his job to know exactly what was happening everywhere. So even though he couldn't be everywhere personally, he knew, and he was in communication with the people who were there. And so I think he, in some ways, he had a really unique vantage point, even as it was playing out, because he wasn't just in Mississippi or just in Alabama. He had the big picture.
One thing, well, first of all, I want to remind everybody who is in attendance, we're going to do Q&A from the audience pretty soon. So make sure you get all of your questions that you have in the Q&A box or in the chat there, and we will answer them, as many of them as we can before we get out of here. But what I want to ask, when you all read this book, you will see that it is incredibly prescient and it is incredibly present, and that you will see pieces of analysis that so accurately explain exactly what's going on today in so many different parts of the country outside of the South also. So you'll see Julian is talking about the rise of the racial wealth gap. He's talking about all of the ways that white revanchism rises up against Black acquisition of political power. He talks about all these things in a way that it feels both like a warning and a guide for how to gird yourself against these things and how to act and move and be empowered. But I want to ask both of you, what piece of the book or what piece of the lectures feels the most timely and has stuck with you the longest?
Well, I guess some of when he's talking about the violence perpetrated against Black people, not just during the movement, but before, and he recounts a lynching that took place at a theater in, I think, somewhere in Tennessee. I think maybe Nashville. And the people who sat in the lower part of the theater could fire X number of shots into the person who was lynched, and the people who sat in the balcony got shots, but fewer because they paid less. And that's what we live with as a nation, and what Black people have lived with always.
I think for me, I think there's a couple of things. So one of my favorite stories that Julian told about, he told this very long 3-class lecture on the Montgomery bus boycott. But there was this great moment where he's talking about so Rosa Parks is arrested on Thursday, late Thursday night, she decides to pursue a legal case, and then, various parts of Black Montgomery spring into action, including the Women's Political Council. They run off 50,000 leaflets. They call E.D. Nixon, who's one of the kind of most stalwart activists in town, to get him on board. And early the next morning, Friday morning, E.D. Nixon starts calling the more political ministers in town. And so Julian would tell this story about E.D. Nixon calling Dr. King at about 6 a.m. that morning, right? And Dr. King is 26 years old at this point, and they've had their first baby, and the baby is like 3 weeks old. It's Yolanda, right? And part of what Julian did was he brought us into Dr. King, not some like big Dr. King in all capital letters, but a person who was going to have to make choices. And I think one of the most profound things about the way that Julian taught was this idea that you have to step in and you have to make choice after choice after choice. And so E.D. Nixon calls King that morning, and like all of us, if somebody's calling you with something they need at 6 in the morning, most of us say, "Can you call me back?" Which is what Dr. King said that morning. And I think just that reminder that like our heroes have to, like, there's nothing natural or inevitable about it, right? And yet still people make these choices, these incredible, like, courageous choices, right? Because he also, I think the other thing that sticks with me is, again, the first day of the sit-ins in Greensboro, right? When it's 4 of them, right? And they're just 4 friends, they're 4 freshmen, right? And they've been sitting around talking about how everybody's talking about the problem and nobody's acting. And so they're like, we're gonna act, right? And this idea that you just can start with like 3 friends, right? And so that idea, right, that you don't have to have, that some of this starts before anybody can see where it can go, right? And that part of it is stepping forward. And I think that's another thing that sort of has stuck with me.
Before I get into the Q&A, I do want to mention today is Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. Yesterday was Julian's birthday. And we're having commemorations for King Day next week. And the question I want to close on before we go to our Q&A is, it's about King. Especially in the spirit of what Time to Teach does, which is really presents people as people and tries to deconstruct a lot of the mythology, like you call it, Jeanne, the fable of the civil rights movement. What are some of Julian's memories of Dr. King in this vein? Are there jokes? Are there any times when he was nervous around Dr. King or anything like that?
Well, he was very proud of the fact that he took a course from Dr. King. He used to say, a lot of people say they were students of Dr. King, but unless they were at Morehouse College and there were 8 of them who could claim that they were students, the rest of them were not literally students of King. He taught a philosophy course. I think, and I think Jeanne is sort of saying that, you're looking at King and Montgomery before he became Martin Luther King. And so the students in SNCC were not, they didn't worship King, and they were not religiously motivated as King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference were. And they they were more militant. They saw themselves as more militant than King, and they were. But I think over time, Julian became a great admirer of Martin Luther King and what he accomplished, and and how he did it, and that he literally gave his life. So to some extent, the people in SNCC used to, they used to make fun, but Julian didn't do that anymore in later life.
Are we ever going to get tapes of SNCC folks roasting Dr. King's
Right.
jackets? Oh, you were talking, Jeanne?
Oh, I was just going to say, one of the other things I remember, right? So there were a couple of lectures on Birmingham, and he was very, and he would talk about Letter from a Birmingham Jail and sort of King making this decision. Obviously, it's Easter weekend. It's a big decision to decide to take an arrest, to go to jail. King's by himself. Again, Birmingham is like one of the most violent cities. Black people called it Bombingham. And then Julian was very clear, right? If you read Letter from a Birmingham Jail, right, that there's that section where King is talking about the white moderate, and starting to feel like the white moderate might be the greater threat to the movement than the Klan. And I think Julian very much highlighted that, in part because right here we have Dr. King. Dr. King's house has been bombed. He's, King is intimately familiar with violence, and yet he's still in that letter. And I think Julian spent a lot of time with that letter with us to sort of make clear a point that I made at the beginning, which is that the variety of ways that people stood in the way of the movement, and that I think sometimes people have this catharsis of oh, I'm not burning crosses on people's lawns. I'm not marauding through the Capitol, and therefore, right, I'm not a racist. And I think one of the things that he made us very aware of, both across the lectures, but with Dr. King, was also that Dr. King really zeroed in on the kind of appalling silence of our friends, kind of.
Then and now.
Then and now, exactly.
Then and now. I want to turn to the audience questions, and we have one here that we just kind of addressed, but it would be useful to talk about a little further. What did Julian think about Stokely Carmichael and the rise of the Black Panthers and the rise of, I think let's go in the rise of Black Power?
Well, I don't think he liked Stokely all that well personally, and he could be difficult. But I think he understood the rise of Black Power, and he certainly rejected the notion that it was Black Power that came along and ruined the accomplishments of the good civil rights people. It was, that it was a necessary part of what they were doing, I think. And I think Julian that would be his and was his attitude toward it. He was moving then into elective politics. So he took and that was a big debate within SNCC. Everything was a big debate within SNCC. But whether or not that was you were being co-opted by making that choice. And Julian said he would not, had he not had the blessings of his fellow SNCCers, he would not have run for office. But they decided that was a worthwhile thing to do. And Stokely Carmichael would not have done that, but that was okay. I mean, different choices for different people.
I think that Julian always, he spent a lot of time on the kind of Mississippi movement, and then the sellout of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party by the Democratic Party. And that, I think part of what he wanted to make clear, and I think the book makes clear, is that Black Power doesn't come out of nowhere. Right? Black Power comes out of the ways that even allies were sort of unwilling to sort of stand by a certain measure of sort of equity and equality. And so, you know, and again, one of the lectures I remember the most is the lecture on the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party challenge in Atlantic City, and the ways that all of the allies were like, take this crappy compromise, right? And people ultimately reject the compromise, but that becomes a turning point, that like the people that you're supposed to be able to trust, that you do everything right, that you bring all the evidence, that you sort of get all the people, you know, you get all these people lined up on your side, and then they start to like, you know, threaten people and offer favors. And so I think one of the other aspects of the master narrative that Julian really took on was the ways that Black power just seems to sail out of nowhere in 1966, and very much like sort of showing it sort of all along, whether, you know, in Cambridge, Maryland, with sort of Gloria Richardson, Robert F. Williams, but also with the ways that SNCC's own work is then, like, you know, again, what we see with the Freedom Democratic Party.
Yeah, next question from the audience is, I guess, a question of scope. How many of Julian's lectures are in existence beyond this? And what fraction of his archives is this?
This is a small part, but I always distinguish between lectures, which were his classroom work, and then speeches, which he literally gave, you know, his entire career. I mean, when the Georgia legislature refused to seat him, that became a national cause, and he became a household name. And so he really was a speaker from like 1966 forward. So there are lots of speeches. And as the chair of the NAACP, he gave sort of an annual address of, you know, the state of Black America, and, you know, a lot of other speeches. So that makes up a big portion of the archives. And then there's lots of correspondence there, and many things that he wrote. He only wrote the one book before this, A Time to Speak, A Time to Act, which was really a compilation of speeches. But he wrote a lot of articles, a lot of forewords for other books, critiques, and so all of that. It's a substantial archive, and it's all at the small library, which is small, a capital S library at the University of Virginia.
Our next question, going back to the lecture on music, specifically on the lecture on rock and roll, could you, if you all remember it, could you describe it, or the gist of it, to us?
It's really how rock and roll it came into existence. So it's more about rhythm and blues leading up to rock and roll, but it has cuts from all kinds of songs, and kind of ends with Elvis Presley. So it doesn't purport to be a history of rock and roll. But it's very meaty in terms of, you know, it's intellectual content. I think people learn a lot, but it's also very funny, and the music is the cuts are great. And he did it almost every year for reunion weekend at the University of Virginia, and so there are copies of it floating around. And as I say, I think, you know, someday, you know, somebody will do something with it.
Here's another one, a good one. Again, in the vein of making sure that people understand who Julian was, who contributed to Julian's development and supported him as a civil rights leader. Who are the people we can read to know more about where his thoughts come from?
Well, certainly his family. I mean, he came from a wonderfully educated family, and even though on both sides, and even though he dropped out of Morehouse one semester short of graduation, which you can imagine how that played with his parents. They were totally supportive. And then I think his allies in SNCC, I think they were the soulmates that he had his whole life, and the greatest influence on him. Dr. Mays, I think at Morehouse, I think that he was an influence. Howard Moore, his brother-in-law, who represented who was a lawyer, represented Angela Davis, represented Julian when he was not seated in the legislature. So those are some that come to mind.
We have, oh, go ahead, Jeanne.
Oh, Ella Baker. I mean, I
Ella
think,
Baker.
Yes, Ella Baker.
Absolutely, both like when.
But he never called her Ella.
No.
She was only Miss Baker, always.
We have another question, which is my favorite one so far. The book has, we have blurbs from Ibram Kendi, we have Doug Brinkley, Taylor Branch, Diane McWhorter, Angela Davis, and Dave Matthews. Can you talk about Dave Matthews? And
well, speaking of music, when Dave Matthews lived in Charlottesville, we knew his sister, who worked with a friend of ours, and his sister, whose name is Jane, kept telling us that her brother had a band and that she thought we really should go see them because he was really good. And we would say, sure, Jane, sometime we'll do that. And so there was a club he had played in a lot smaller places, but he had graduated to a club in Charlottesville called Tracks, which was quite large. And we finally went one night, and I will say that we recognized that we had heard and seen something special. And it was literally like maybe 2 weeks before the Dave Matthews Band appeared on David Letterman. And, they had been on college campuses and it had been quite strategic, but then the world knew about them after. So David became a close friend of ours in Charlottesville, and is a great guy. And so he graciously agreed to blurb the book, even though that's not normally what David does. And he gave it a great thought, and it's a wonderful blurb, and we're delighted to have it.
I bet you all did not think you were going to be getting a Dave Matthews Band origin story in this Zoom. We have another question that I think is really good and something we have not yet talked about. And I just want to spend a little time for both of you all to talk about the photography in this book. Yeah.
Yes, and I'm glad that came up, because we should have thanked Danny at the beginning. Danny Lyon was one of the SNCC photographers. As I understand it, they had talk about Julian being prescient. So was their leader, and he wanted he would tell people, write things down, and he brought in the photographers, and so Danny was one of them, and he went on to fame as a photographer, but he loved Julian, and so he was very generous in allowing us to use all these wonderful photographs. And so they're all taken during his stint as a photographer with SNCC. So the people in them are primarily SNCC people, although there's also Bob Dylan, speaking of music. And I think one of the things that it does is show the reader, these were the leaders of this movement and how young they were. They look young because they were young.
And I got to say, if you are able to get your hands on a copy of Memories of the Civil Rights Movement, the Southern Civil Rights Movement, then you should. It's an amazing photo book. Yeah. This is a question, and will probably be our last question, depending on how long our answers are here. It's something that we discussed in the beginning, but I do think it's probably worth closing out on, and that's just meditating on a minute, on for a moment about what Julian would say or think or perceive about this moment in America. Again, so much of the book is predictive, is prescient, is eerily, relevant today. But that's not exactly the same as trying to take his analytical framework and apply it to the moment. So I know it's an impossible question to really answer, but I'm going to ask it anyways.
Jeanne, you want to?
I mean, I think I want to begin by something that Pam said before, which is sort of that Julian really admired Black Lives Matter. And I think one of the things that's been so, let's just say, annoying about so many commentators is the ways they try to sort of say the Civil Rights Movement did it the right way and Black Lives Matter is not doing it the right way and they should learn from the Civil Rights Movement. And, one of the greatest things I think I learned from Julian, but I think one can take from the book, right, is the Civil Rights Movement was disruptive. It was unreasonable. It had snappy slogans. It was meant to make people unsettled. They were young. Like there was lots of adults within the Black community that didn't agree with what SNCC was doing, right? So much of the way that if you get into the detail of what Julian gives us, I think shows us that many of the kind of criticisms of Black Lives Matter, many of the ways people hold it at a distance, right? Many of the ways that people are like, oh, be like King, be like King. You're like, King got arrested 30 times, right? I think that would be the first place I would start, is that kind of moving us past this kind of kind of saccharine idea of what our past is like and what movements are like, and reminding us what actually change has taken, what it took to get change in the past and therefore what it's going to take now. And again, particularly sort of how disruptive the civil rights movement was, King, SNCC, the whole 9 yards.
And if you want a snappy slogan for now, I think Julian would say, don't agonize, organize, and do the work. I mean, this is a moment and we got to seize it.
Don't agonize, organize. Yeah, we should put that on some shirts. I think it might sell. Well, I want to thank Pam and Jeanne again for putting all this together, for being the reason for why we are here, for this wonderful conversation. Thank everybody for joining us, for your wonderful questions. And I want to turn it back over as we close out.
Van, great moderating. And Pam and Jeanne, your book is such a tribute to Julian Bond and such a service, especially the younger generations who can learn much from the Southern Civil Rights Movement and Julian Bond's insightful teaching about how it really was. To everyone watching, thanks again for tuning in. Remember, you can find a link in the chat column to purchase Julian Bond's Time to Teach. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.
Thank you all.
Thank you.